All right, we are back for episode 86 of Digital Divination. And as you can tell, this is a very special episode because we have a guest, Ron Lundeen, who's come back from some other place to join us for this episode. Welcome, Ron.
Well, I thought the guest you were talking about is the Mandalorian mannequin behind you. That's been your guest for a couple of sessions now.
Yeah, he was here last time too. He's been helping me through some stuff. Dinjar has been really awesome. Before we get started, most people know that Ron is a lawyer, and I'm going to let Ron make a disclaimer at this point, just to make sure he doesn't get in trouble with anything.
Oh, it is a required disclaimer. I am an employee of Wizards of the Coast, but any views I express here are mine only and do not reflect those of Wizards of the Coast.
All right, excellent. I just want to make sure we got that knocked out, and because I knew we had to do it.
That's right.
Well, I just want to say that the views that I express in this podcast are the express views of the Wizards of the Coast. So you know that.
Wait, that's fair, right?
Did I say Coast? Sorry, I meant Toast. Wizards of the Toast. I'm being sponsored by a new appliance company.
Alrighty, Wizards of the Toast. That's great.
Yes. I was going to say something about Gizzards of the Most, but I don't know. I don't have anything there. So, but speaking of gizzards, another reason why
I just want to acknowledge the best segue I've probably heard in all of 2023.
All right. So speaking of that, so I asked Ron if he could come in and fill in for me because I had a really major surgery on my abdomen. I showed Ron a picture of it. Jason, I don't know if you want to see it, but it's a really big incision. Okay. And they opened me up and they took out some of my organs that weren't working really well and sewed me back up. And this is a week and a half ago. So, I wasn't sure how functioning I would be at this point. Had a week in the hospital now, about 5 days at home. Doing pretty good, but still a little pain and discomfort, obviously, to deal with because my gizzard's been kind of opened up. So thanks so much,
gizzards
Ron.
have been roasted.
Yes.
You've been roasted?
Shrunken, but
mostly shrunken. And then they move up the surgery a little bit too. So this was going to be like at a time where you may have been in the hospital since they did it earlier. You're out of the hospital, and
it was scheduled to be originally the 23rd, which was 2 days ago. Then it got moved up 10 days. So there's like no way I could have done it, and especially like my first 4 days after surgery was the hardest 4 days of my life. It was really, really.
Oh my goodness!
Luckily, I had some great painkillers, but it was just unfortunately one of the things that happens is you get a lot of gas buildup in your systems because your gizzards, your bowels aren't moving things through, and so I was just like super like bloated, and it was putting so much pressure on my lungs. I had a hard time breathing.
Oh no!
Oh my goodness!
I was like laboring to breathe every second of the day for like 3 days until it finally started moving. So it was, it's like feeling like you're suffocating, but you're not kind of thing. And it's just weird, Anyway.
That sounds suspicious. My brother had COVID. I was hospitalized for it, and he said it was just one of the things where you breathe in, you take like half of your usual breath in, and then suddenly you realize, wait, I can't breathe in any more than this.
Yes.
With that, without feeling the strain, without feeling it hurting. He said it was just breathing was the most awful thing.
Yes.
So, but most importantly, how are you doing now, John?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm getting up and about. It's a long full healing process, but I went up to Camino. We're dealing with contractors and stuff still. I got a nephew up there painting. Mostly I can do like a couple hours vertical, like sitting up, and then I got to take a break because my, basically they cut through all the stomach muscles. So all that's, it's a vertical slit. So it's not as bad as it could be, but those still kind of get wore out. So we
have a hard 120-minute limit on today's podcast.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to go that far. I was going to say, I saw the email for Wednesday night's game, though. I'll come. I may have to go lay on the couch occasionally in the game.
Okay.
so I'll be throwing my dice long distance. What did it end up with? Okay. So anyway, thanks so much for joining us here, and I'm glad to hear that you might be more available for doing things down the road. I think that's
from time to time, absolutely. I think that there's something really important about seeing, people that are creators of the stuff that you love and hearing what they have to say. That's one of the reasons I tune in every show for the two of you. I mean, you're both creating stuff that I like, and I want to hear you talk about it, even if I have to wait like a long time to hear about Jason's pistol dancer.
Look, was it worth it? I don't know.
It was.
Worth all that build up. Yeah. Okay, good. Good. I'm glad to hear it.
3 sessions to talk. And it's almost like Jimmy Kimmel and Ben Affleck. Apologies to Ben Affleck. We're going to have to bump you till next time. That was the pistol dancer, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, for today, I thought we would kind of keep the topic a little light and unfocused, probably. So
that's what we do best.
I know. I was going to say not different than what we would normally do, but I thought we could, in light of the fact that there's a lot of changes going on in the tabletop RPG industry with new versions coming out, Paizo's remastered, whatever Wizards of the Coast is doing. I don't even know what it's called anymore. I know Cobalt Press is coming out with their new thing. So there's lots of Savage Lands just announced 2nd edition, right? So lots of.
Oh wait, did they? I've been really excited about.
Yeah, it was announced
Savage Worlds, right?
Savage Worlds, yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so I saw that. I said, oh, well, that's kind of cool. So a lot of folks are kind of revamping things. So I thought maybe we could talk about like our perception is nobody here who is currently working on Starfinder of the future of Starfinder.
Okay.
So something like that. And I know Ron jokingly said that this is great. Jason can tell us all about that earlier, but I know Jason doesn't know because
I know a few things, but I can't say.
I know.
That's right. That's fair. I made my disclaimer about my employer earlier. We understand you've got a disclaimer about yours. Yeah. Before we talk about the future, I think one of the things that I really want to point out about the past and present, maybe of Starfinder, is there've been it's success, and I think it has. I think what its success is really attributable to is that there just aren't a lot of other science fiction role-playing games that have a lot of stickiness, right?
Right.
I mean, Traveler has been really long running, and I know people that are big fans of that, but it's sort of, it has occasional, it's just kind of a low-level presence there. We get a lot of people that have Star Wars or Star Trek science fiction role-playing games, and then they end up changing licenses or moving from company to company, so they don't actually seem to stick around very long. I think Starfinder is now at the point where it's a world that that is really richly textured, has a lot to it, and by this point we can say it's kind of been around for a really long time. It's proven quite a bit of staying power.
Yeah.
So before we talk about where it's going to go, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that it's really a big success just in getting to where it is right now.
Well, and that's it. Go ahead, Jason.
I was to say it kind of. I mean, not that it wasn't intended to be, but it was kind of created as a bit of a stopgap between first and second edition Pathfinder to be like, well, let's put out something, and we had a lot of people who are passionate about it at the company, like Pathfinder takes place in a world where there are other planets in the system, right? Like there is a small science fiction element to it to begin with, but then filtered through the lens more through like what's it called, spell and sorcery, no, sword and lasers or whatever you want, that sort of genre, John Carter kind of stuff. But then to sort of take that and move it fully into science fiction or science fantasy. It was the intent to sort of be like, hey, we can do other things, and then pull some pressure off of Pathfinder a little bit so that we can move on to second edition. But it's been a great success. for that.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I wanted to build up on. The fact that it started up as more of the stopgap, and that's been now 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? 6 years ago.
Right.
And if you think back, or if I think back to, with when second edition started the genesis in people's minds, right? I imagine that had to happen around the 6th or 7th year of Pathfinder. And they had to start thinking, hey, we need to come up with a new edition for this, because it's a several year process, if I'm not mistaken, for doing that. Yeah. And they had the testing and everything else from that. So one of the things that gets me thinking is that within the next couple years, if not already, and I'm not going to ask for any confirmation of this, that Starfinder should be going through that iteration as well. Now, we just had Starfinder Enhanced announced, and it's going to be coming out in October. It would be really silly to do Starfinder Enhanced and then the next year say, oh, we're going to crash the whole system. But I would expect that maybe 3 years from now that we'd be looking at a playtest as a minimum. That's kind of my educated guess.
I don't know. It might be sooner than that. I think that I got two thoughts about that. I think first you mentioned that you two both mentioned the stopgap, and I'm sure our listeners know that specifically that is the gap between Pathfinder First Edition and Pathfinder Second Edition, because as soon as you announce a new edition of a game, sales generally just really start to decline. And apparently, I mean, that's where I got put on the Pathfinder Adventure Path line, was to shepherd the very last of the First Edition Adventure Path. They're like, okay, new guy, you can't possibly screw up the sales of this one. So you go. But I do think I can certainly see a universe in which Starfinder Enhanced comes out this fall. Is that September, October, I want to say?
October, I believe.
Yeah.
October. Where it comes out this fall, and then sometimes maybe even early next year, Paizo lets the public know, hey, Starfinder Enhanced was kind of finishing, right? It was the icing on the cake of Starfinder. We'll do some more adventures maybe, but we're kind of not doing a whole lot. We call that done now. Some of the initial, things about witch warpers and technomancers and Solarians, they're better now. We've got our sort of ideal version of those, and we're rolling into a Starfinder Second Edition. And I certainly would expect that they'd be like, and as a stopgap between the two, we're announcing Rangefinder, the Wild West version of Pathfinder.
Oh,
and
yeah.
And each time they keep building more and more games to cover the gaps between.
Oh my God!
Right, it just keeps stacking up. So
I mean, to talk about one of those things, Ron, like we know that there's going to be another adventure path coming out next year, Mechageddon, because that was announced pretty recently. So, but that is not coming out. That's coming out after Enhanced. So there is, plans to continue with current Starfinder, at least visible to the public, right?
Wait. Then my timing's wrong. Mechageddon is not 2023.
No.
How long are you going to make me wait for it? It sounds awesome, and you're making me wait for longer than I thought I had to wait.
It has been. I think was going to be a little bit around Enhanced the same time, and then it got pushed a bit because some people left the company and some other people moved around in the company. All that kind of stuff happens, and so there was not a whole lot of people in Starfinder for a little bit, and then. Now they're that Dustin's on the team, and so there's a little more room to sort of get back on track, essentially, right? And like you said, a lot of people were from Starfinder kind of pulled over to help with the remaster, so not a lot of work hours have been being put into Starfinder as they could be, right? Because putting out other fires as usual.
Yeah, it's something Jason and I actually talked about offline before, about the remastered versions of Second Edition. Getting some of the Starfinder support there. But along those lines, though, I would think that once those remastered books are done and kicking out, right, which will be next year, that Starfinder Remastered or whatever they want to call it, that you'd think that would be next on the docket as well, though.
I mean, we're on the brink of the Orc license coming out and being attached to the remaster, the Pathfinder remaster. It seems like it's a ripe time to start thinking about, instead of just reprinting the core rulebook again with a different license in the back of it, what about more stuff or different stuff, or taking the like you said, maybe a Starfinder remaster that takes some of the APG, whatever, not APG, the character operations manual
the
classes,
the com,
and putting them in sort of core, right, and then switching things around, right, like they're doing with the Pathfinder remaster.
Well, but if we skip that back, right? I'm now so, I mean, it's been more than a year since I left, just over a year since I left Paizo. So my window into like what people are working on when is now pure guesswork.
Sure.
But the remaster, two remaster books that are coming out this fall are probably already like done and approved and off to the printers or close to it. And the next two are probably not that much farther to go, right? Even though we're not going to see them until next year, they get done with and out of everybody's hands many months before that. And that's the point at which people would be working on whatever's next. And whatever that next is hasn't been announced yet. Maybe it's another couple of remaster books. Maybe it is Starfinder in some remaster way. Whatever the next is probably pretty close to the things people are going to be working on now.
Yeah, I mean, you have to think about like we have the design team, right? And the design team did actually do a lot of work on the original Starfinder, although it was eventually turned over to the Starfinder team to sort of finish things off, like Owen and Rob McCreary to polish off the classes and stuff like that. But there were a lot of the sort of core stuff was worked on by the design team. So is a second edition of Starfinder for there to be room on the design team's plate? The Pathfinder remaster's got to be done and dusted, right?
Yeah.
So it is definitely sometime in the future. I mean, we don't know what the future will hold, obviously, but like it would have to be in the future. It having doing the work sort of now is a lot of.
I would imagine that when that started taking place, we would see some more. The Starfinder team's tiny now. I think we might see a little bit more hiring.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah.
Or contraction in the number of products, right? I think that the move from monthly to bi-monthly APs and then to some of the stuff that's coming out of single volumes, that's I mean, that's great. That's a great move.
Right. And I think we've already sort of like, because we haven't had another, I mean, the thing of the announcement process is always so far in advance for me. We announced Starfinder Enhanced. Think, what is there a hardcover after Starfinder Enhanced, right? But we know about Mechageddon that's coming out, but nothing else has been announced. So maybe there is already been a sort of contraction of products and that sort of thing. But but we don't know exactly.
Yeah, and that's kind of ideal for Starfinder Enhanced because what you don't want to do is say, here is sort of we've made sort of improvements to the the core rule. We frosted the cake of the rules here in this pretty way, and now we're not going to serve you a piece. I mean, so Mechageddon coming out afterward is great because it's like, hey, we've done these updates, these sort of quality of life updates to the rules. Now we're literally giving you a thing to go play with them.
Right.
So,
all that being said, though, people will if Starfinder Second Edition comes out, people will still play First Edition. People are still playing First Edition Pathfinder, right? Mm-hmm. So having this sort of ideal version of quote unquote First Edition Starfinder is good to have out there for the people who want to keep supporting it. And we'll still be putting out maps and other small things that you can use with your games that don't have necessarily a mechanical tie-in. Exactly, they're still Starfinder-y, but you don't need to have Second Edition to use this map or these cards. Maybe there's a weird face deck or something like that. I think there's a thing. No, it's come out. The Starfinder deck of NPCs is out there.
The deck of many NPCs for
Starfinder. I think it's out there. I think I have it. I have it. I have a physical copy of it, so I think it's out there. At least it has to have been announced because I have a physical copy of it.
Probably
Right?
was
Like, there's
announced.
No way
I don't know that I have a copy of it. So
okay, it's maybe
I
not
haven't
fully
been
out
able to
there.
find
I mean, my Pathfinder one is right here.
Sure, yes,
but I
that
don't
was
have
a
the
little bit
Starfinder
ago.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, because actually, I mean, I know I worked on that, so it's been a bit, since it was concepted and done. And those are things that you don't really need the rules for. It's just like, here's some names and some I mean, not names, but here's some species and here's some planets and here's some motivations and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think an important thing to remember, I'm a huge Starfinder fan, as I know you guys are as well.
What?
Starfinder, the player base is like 20% of the Pathfinder player base. It's a lot tinier. So to invest a lot of time and effort and like they're doing the Pathfinder now, it's got to be a secondary, tertiary concern. They have way bigger fish to fry, and when they can get to that, they will. So there's obviously not going to be a lot of hurry there.
Right. Well, that was my point about the timing. I mean, to some degree, a lot of those fish are already fried or finishing up the frying, and then they can move. Once they move and know what they're going to do, and it's appropriate allocation of resources, then they start making like the announcements and get everybody sort of hyped for the stuff that's coming out.
Sure, yeah.
So,
I want to ask a sort of a related question to the two of you that I don't think either we've talked about yet. Why do you think fantasy games are generally more popular than science fiction games, like in terms of market audience?
Ooh, I have a guess. Can I make my guess?
Hey, make your guess.
Fantasy games can be disconnected from the setting much more easily than sci-fi games can be disconnected from the setting. Because as soon as you've got the sort of general, there are elves and dwarves and dragons and fireballs, then whether those are Game of Thrones type dragons and fireballs, or whether they're J.R.R. Tolkien types dwarves and elves, or whether there's something that's kind of a mix of those or a variant of those that you make up yourself, super easy to do. You got kind of all the tools from a lot of different intellectual properties that have all been kind of thrown in together. But science fiction worlds tend to be defined more narrowly on what they have or they don't have, right? So you've got Star Wars, which is, it has its own sort of things in it that Star Trek doesn't have, that games like Mass Effect, do entirely differently, right? Mm-hmm. And so there isn't sort of this sort of smooth agreement about, well, at least there's, dwarves and elves and dragons and fireballs in it throughout science fiction. So I think that what that means is people who are making science fiction games are sort of one of the first hurdles they have to make is, all right, well, here's how our science fiction, maybe it's going to be like other science fiction, but here's the way in which ours differs.
Right.
And Starfinder does that and we specifically have magic, and we specifically have sort of this multicultural world. And even if you're not using the Pact Worlds, the rule system itself requires sort of a multiculturalism that is an assumption that a lot of science fiction might not have, for example.
Yeah, that's true.
That's why I think science fiction role-playing games tend to not do as well, is because they need to cling to an IP or some sort of, if not an existing intellectual property, a vision of the game universe that is more distinct than sort of the broad fantasy ones can be. There's my answer.
Good answer.
I'm going to add something to that, and I'm going to say a lot of it is generational and depth of history. You think of the hundreds of years now that we've had fantasy writing available compared to what is now, how much we've had of the hard science fiction. And when you look at generationally, if you look at video games, there aren't very many fantasy video games, right? There's way more science fiction-y video games. Even growing up as a kid, you'd have some Dungeon Quest, or you'd have, some early video games. You had a lot more of the attacking aliens or whatever. So something about maybe the context, in a video game context, maybe something more modern sci-fi just kind of made more sense to people. But is somebody growing up and, for me, I coming across generations, I know folks older than me are way more into the dwarves and elves and fantasy stuff than they are into the sci-fi type of video games, though they still might be into sci-fi. And so maybe it's just kind of generationally what they grew up with reading and playing versus like younger people. A lot of them are doing video games. And so maybe that's kind of where we've seen growth over. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking of a different answer than Ron.
That's fair.
What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, to think about the video games thing, if you're saying more recently they're more sci-fi than fantasy, that's probably true. I feel like me growing up, I can think of probably about an equal number of both of those, honestly, genre wise. Like, I played a lot of, Might Magic and Ultima and Bard's Tale and very much based off of Dungeons and Dragons and the Gold Box SSI stuff, right? But also, more like one of those earlier Atari 2600 games is Adventure, right? And that's got a dragon in it. But I think the part of the reason of this, sort of to talk about, sort of tack on to what Ron said, is that the way fantasy works, it kind of looks backwards, right? And what you look behind you is kind of always the same in a lot of ways, right? But science fiction looks forward, and science fiction guesses a lot about what the future is going to be, and then the future comes, and then the science fiction is either wrong or right. So like you look at something that's like the first bunch of science fiction is going to the moon. How do they go to the moon? Out of a big bullet, which is not too far from a rocket, but like, it's different enough. And there's no, not to say there's no, but there's probably like a very small sliver of Jules Verne-esque sci-fi games that exist, right? That vision of the future isn't stick in our minds because we've past that time, essentially, right?
I played a lot of Space 1889 role-playing game when I was younger.
Exactly. And like then you think about like moving up, you think about like stuff from the 70s and 80s, the cassette futurism of Alien or 2001, right? What year is it? It's 2023. We've gone 20 some years past 2001, A Space Odyssey, right? Like it's out of date in a lot of ways. Whereas the past can never be out of date because it's behind us and it has already happened. So that's why I think people can. It's sort of related to what Devon said. People can kind of grok fantasy a lot easier as a whole than grokking sci-fi because a lot of people think about it as one way. Is it the Expanse hard sci-fi only human situation, or is it a Star Wars Cantina situation, or is it a Star Trek types? There's humans, but there's also aliens, but they have a different vibe. Like because Star Wars has kind of a weird. It's the future, and it's future-y, it's science fiction-y, but it's kind of fantasy-ish, and it's. You go to bars and obviously there's a hokey old time religion, but like everything's kind of grungier. And whereas you look at like Star Trek, it's very, very high tech and clean lines and that sort of thing. So there's clearly lots of different aesthetics. Sci-fi can do so much, and fantasy can do a ton too. But it like what Ron said, there's kind of a core thing that makes it fantasy, and you can kind of grab onto that. Go ahead.
Oh, I want to play on that a little bit by letting you guys know I was at Mopop today, the Museum of Pop Culture here in Seattle.
Nice.
It's great. I'd been there once, but it was years ago.
Okay.
And here's something that feeds right into this conversation. They've got a fantasy room, right? Mm-hmm. It's a bunch of fantasy exhibits, and I can see a sort of role-playing game universe or some sort of literary universe in which all of those things are in it, right? So you've got the outfit that the Cowardly Lion wore in The Wizard of Oz. Okay, so you got this sort of, talking animal. Yeah. You've got the helmet and axe that Gimli had in Lord of the Rings. You've got some of the robes from the Harry Potter franchise. You've got the a lot of the puppets from the latest Dark Crystal Age of Resistance thing.
Nice.
I could walk around that whole room and think, all right, all of these might exist in the same world. But when I do the same in the sci-fi room, where I'm like, oh, here's the outfit that I think Daryl Hannah wore in Blade Runner,
Right.
And it's just across the way from a Dalek from Doctor Who, and over here is one of the actual models used for the AT-ATs on Hoth and Empire Strikes Back. No, these are all very different. I had to really struggle to think how those could ever exist in like all kind of thrown into the same game.
Yeah. To sort of say when I was working on the Fortune's Fool tarot based game, the original idea of it was going to be a modern day, urban fantasy with angels and devils and demons and sort of setting. And when we were thinking about it, it was like, well, we got to teach the people how to use the tarot cards in this way. And the system itself has, and how you manipulate the deck in your favor with fate and cast spells and all that kind of stuff. That's its own thing. And then to sort of tack on this setting stuff, which is, again, you'd have to explain what it is and how it works, how the magic works. Like in a modern sense, it was two things that people would have to learn as a barrier to entry. So what we did is we said, well, let's just make it elves and dwarves and throw it into sort of like, the real world Renaissance, which people can kind of understand by going to Renaissance fairs. Like they kind of get a general idea. I mean, it was not supposed to be the historical Renaissance. It was kind of like the idea of the Renaissance, but you could have Shakespeare and you could have Galileo and you could have those people in it. But they could also be contemporaries, even though they were literally lived hundreds of years apart. And that's what I think made it sort of easier to grok for people to go, oh, I can understand. I want to be an elf who's a noble who, can maybe cast some spells. Oh, I picked these things and I made my character. Now I've got to understand how that character works with the tarot deck, right? So just to get back on the sort of like why fantasy is as big as it is, because it has that sort of touchstone of the depth of people. I guess it's inertia almost, right? The inertia of the past, right?
Yeah, 100%. So,
yeah, but
how would you change? What would you change to make science fantasy more tractable for people, though?
I mean, I think that's kind of what Starfinder does, honestly, right? Because it has the magic and it has dragons and it has elves, people can kind of grok that a little bit. And you can see a lot of people going like, well, I just want to play a space dwarf. Great, you can play a space dwarf. And I know about dwarves and I just put space in front of it and that's enough of a little bit of a flavor twist. And you can still be mining and going into a dungeon that happens to be in a spaceship or a giant planet or something like that. Like Starfinder does, because it comes from Pathfinder. It has that I don't want to use inertia again, but it has that sort of touchstone that you can go with and move. And then we can throw in, oh, do you want to be a blob person? You can be a blob person. You want to be a weird a jellyfish, a weird starfish with eyeballs on their elbows. Great, yeah. And they change shape. Yeah, I get it. I grok it. And for the people who really want all the wild stuff, and here's 100 different playable species you can choose from. Go nuts. And you can just So I think that's the way, and that's why I think Starfinder has the cache that it does, because then the people like it. They can get it like, well, finally, I can get my lasers. I can have my elf shoot a laser gun. I mean, like, what was it? Keep on the Borderlands. Eventually, you saw. Oh my gosh, you're in a crashed spaceship. I mean, Pathfinder has.
The Expedition to the Barrier Peaks.
Expedition to the Barrier Peaks.
I remember that. Yeah.
Nearly every one of the old Might and Magic role-playing video games did that. You got to the high level. You were, oh my god, now I'm fighting robots with lasers. But it still works because it's a crashed spaceship on a fantasy world. Or the world was built to look like a fantasy world, but it was really by people of a higher intelligence just for the reason to. And so I cursed and that threw me off. I don't know why I cursed.
Now I gotta edit all the time. Out. I'm just gonna say.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
But yeah. I think that's what helps Starfinder stick. I've been stuck around for 6 years or however long it's been.
Well, I think you're not wrong. I have another reason though. Why Starfinder's been so successful. Part of the thing that makes fantasy kind of one thing that has a lot of different entry points, the George R.R. Martin type of stuff, and then some of the new things that come in, the Patrick Rothfuss is doing, and things. I mean, it's the way that a lot of people can come into it. Fantasy itself accommodates a lot of different types of stories and tropes. And one of the things that makes Starfinder very successful, I think, is that Starfinder works very, very hard to accommodate every kind of trope. You want to play Starship Troopers fantasy. Great. Not only can we accommodate that, we've got this whole 6-part adventure path that you can go do just that Starship Troopers fantasy. Do you want to be kind of the gritty, seedy underbelly of a sprawling urban metropolis? Well, hey, there's a space station that's all about that you can go do it. You want to be Barsoom, where you're, full-on John Carter? There's the full-on John Carter planet. I mean, it's one of the things that I really like about Starfinder is when people say, I wish I could play a sci-fi adventure in which X, I almost immediately can tell you where or how you'd set that kind of thing in Starfinder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mm-hmm. Indeed. It's the same, unsurprisingly, the same ethos as the world of Galarian. It has all of these different various fantasy takes, right? Ancient Egyptian fantasy, French Revolution fantasy, weird devil worshipping fantasy. It's the cliche fantasy map where you're like, over here's this world and over here's that. That it makes it like almost like an amusement park. Is taken to the extreme in Starfinder, because you can also just make a whole world an amusement park. Wink. And then have all those stories you're talking about. Do you want to do a time travel adventure? Well, we don't quite have the rules for that yet, but hey, it would not be difficult to do. You want to do, again, all the other things that you were talking about, Ron. We have the not only like the ability for the rules to kind of work that way, but like literally we can point at a place that's in the setting and say, that's the place to do that if you want to, or, and then sometimes we flesh it out even more, right? So you can get deep and really get into the stuff that you want to do. Hey, here's the mechs fighting kaiju planet. Great, that's what people want. That get people excited.
Now, I have a question then, given the kind of the malleability of the Starfinder universe and rule set and everything. What, if anything, is missing from Starfinder?
Well, I did just sort of point out time travel, which is a thing.
Time travel was exactly the thing that I would say. It doesn't. Time travel. It's got a missing piece of history, and that makes any story that has you jumping around through history really hard to do. And so that gap is sort of a you may not pass kind of time travel-ish kind of thing.
Right, and if you were to, I could talk about how I would have done time travel in Starfinder for forever, because it is one of my favorite sci-fi things. I think that sort of you can get around that idea by not necessarily saying you get a time machine, you can go and do whatever you want. You get shunted through time because of we have now a precog who's got this idea. So time travel's in there a little bit. It's like, oh, I'm from the past, or I'm from the future, and now I'm in this world, and now I have these powers because I remember the future, right? So there's with the precog in Galactic Magic, there's a little bit of that in there, but we still haven't gone and laid out like how would you do a time travel campaign in Starfinder. I think you'd have to go in a certain way.
Yeah, there's actually there's a set of organized play specials. One's a Pathfinder, one's a Starfinder, that are tied together via time travel. Yeah. So it's a very tenuous try, right? Tie. It's not a huge thing, but it is kind of neat because basically it's the old, the solution is somebody has to stay behind, and you get to meet them in the future, having them had to come the long way rather than the short way. So
well, that's really a role-playing game. I'm not going to say any role-playing game, but a role-playing game that is built upon incremental character progression, the way that Pathfinder and Starfinder are, by its nature makes time travel really difficult because you can never be better earlier. You're always better later. And and then you have to sort of break the progression when you want to do something time traveling. Okay, my 19th level self comes back in time to tell me a thing. All right, well, you've just locked me into what my 19th level build is going to be, right?
Yeah. You can.
You could kind of timeline. Yeah, you can weasel with a little bit, say what your 19th level self might have become, but then at that point you're hardly telling enough of that, and you're hardly telling a time travel story.
Then it becomes more multiverse, right?
Yeah. Time travel stories do need to have that very tight plotting, which is difficult to do in a sort of without the sort of buy-in from players to be like, this is what's going to happen in the future. Oh yeah, I love that. That sort of plotting. Okay, so I might as well tell you because I don't think I'll ever get a chance to do it. So here's the idea that I would have had for a time travel AP for Starfinder. The first volume sort of happens when the PCs sort of like get called to do something in, maybe an application, right? But at the end of this, some weird nonsense is happening. And so when they get to the end of that volume, they find and actually meet the actual AP's big bad and kill him. And basically when they meet him, he's like, you did this to me. And they're like, we've never met you before. And he's like, no, I'll kill you. No, this time I'll definitely kill you. Or I'll kill you before it even happens or something like that. But they finish him off. Right. And and when they do that, they get blasted into the future. And so they're in the future, which is controlled by the big bad. I kind of had this idea that maybe the big bads of this would be Rakshasas, because we sort of talked about how Rakshasas like to break taboos, and what's more taboo than like going back in time and changing the past. So in the future, there's the world is kind of controlled by a Rakshasa empire or something like that, right? And so they've got to figure out what's going on there, and then essentially, basically, maybe hop around in time a little bit in the future, right? You never hop back past your players. Maybe there's a little bit in there but you never meet up or whatever something. But essentially, it becomes one of those bootstrap paradoxes, right? Where you at the final volume you have a fight with the big bad, and when you defeat the big bad, he's actually sent back in time and weakened essentially to the first adventure. So that's sort of it's the classic closed loop kind of stuff. That would be great. The idea too is that the future would be really weird. Like the language would be different, and it'd be like you'd have to sort of figure out the technology, or there'd be like old technology that is like being worshipped in that sort of anyway. The whole thing would be sort of vaguely. The idea was it's really inspired by the comic book Paper Girls, where they're in 1983, and they get blasted to the future, where they find an Apple iPod, and like, we don't know what this is, and then they find a time machine, and in the future there's a resistance against the sort of Big Brother corporation, which is kind of weirdly Apple. It's that kind of stuff, and so that was I had to have a full outline for it, of course, because why work on something if it wasn't going to happen? But I started thinking about titles and stuff like that, because that's often where I begin.
So what title? What's the title of this adventure?
I've got like now I've forgotten what the titles were. It would all be like words like tomorrow's today, or like I think it was the first one would be called The Beginning of the End, and the last one would be called The End of the Beginning, or something like that.
Time altogether. Coming soon to Starfinder Infinite. That's
I thought about it too. I've toyed with it in my head to maybe do it in Infinite, but I never got around to it.
I can't get people talking about like plot ideas without yes-anding all the way through. You talked about how each one would be, like the future would be sort of different, weird, and awful, but maybe there's little cases where they get kicked back. Each one of those would change what the future is.
That's great. Yeah.
And so they have to like adjust some initially with big swings, and eventually smaller swings to make the future exactly what it needs to be for them to defeat this person at the end of the AP to send him back to. This could be awesome. I'll write volume 3. I'm good at writing volume 3s of APs.
Well, there was also a thing. I was like, did I really want? Like, could I sustain that for 6 volumes? I don't know if I could. It would probably
maybe
been
3.
Like
you could do it for 3.
But 3, definitely would have been a 3 one. But then I was like, is that enough? So I had I was going back and forth about it. Okay. That's sort of one of the things I would have really liked to have done, because I really enjoy time travel stories and doing time travel in a way that has like self-fulfilling prophecies and bootstrap paradoxes and that kind of stuff.
Well, cool.
Yeah.
Well, Ron, I really appreciate you joining us on the show, and Jason allowing this former dude on. I appreciate you not getting all mad at that.
Room for me.
I haven't like talked to Ron in almost a year too, so this is really great to see him.
This is nice. Yeah.
Now, this is going to be a tough part, right? I got to do a sign off. How is this going to work? Okay. Well,
do you want to do the sign off? And I'm Jason.
And I'm Ron. And this has been Digital Divination.
Okay. Close enough.
There we go.
Close enough.
We did it.
We
Without any practice, that's just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.